In this lesson, we are going to be completing the square when a equals 1 to solve a quadratic equation. Up until this point, we have learned 4 different methods to solve a quadratic equation. The first method being factoring, when we were given a quadratic and asked to factor it to solve for x. The second method being the square root method, we were given a quadratic equation with no b value and set x squared equal to a number, took the square root of each side to solve for x. The third method being the quadratic formula, where we learned the song to x equals negative b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And the fourth method, graphing, when we were asked to find the x-intercepts to solve for x. And the method we will be learning today is called completing the square. And the equation that we're going to need for completing the square is b over 2 squared. So first we're going to go through the steps. Make sure you write them down, and then we will go over them in the examples, and hopefully they'll make a little more sense to you. So step number 1 is we're going to move the c value to one side all by itself. Step 2 is to make sure that the leading coefficient is 1, and then we're going to take the coefficient of b, divide it by 2, and then square it. So that's where our b over 2 squared equation comes in. The third step is to add that value that we get to both sides of the equation. The fourth step is to write one side as a perfect square. And the fifth step is to take the square root of both sides and then solve for x. So the first thing we're going to do is practice the b over 2 squared. So this says to find the term that should be added to the expression to create a perfect square trinomial. So remember, our formula is b over 2 squared. So our b value in this is positive 14. So plugging that into our equation, we get 14 over 2 squared. We know that 14 divided by 2 is 7. 7 squared is 49. In the second example, our b value is negative 2. Now do not forget the negative sign because that will be important. So we get negative 2 divided by 2 in parentheses squared, which is a negative 1 squared, which is 1. In the third example, we get a positive 7 for our b value. So we have 7 divided by 2 squared. And you can do this one in two separate ways. You can leave it in fraction form, which I know scares many of you. But that would be 7 squared over 2 squared, which would be 49 over 4. Or we know that 7 divided by 2 is 3.5. 3.5 squared will give us 12.25. And in the last example, our b value is negative 16. Again, don't forget our negative sign. So plugging it into our equation, we get negative 16 over 2 squared. Negative 16 divided by 2 is a negative 8. Don't forget your parentheses, because remember, sometimes your calculators won't take into account that a negative number times a negative number is a positive number. So negative 8 squared, we know, is 64. So now that we've learned the steps and how to use the formula, let's do an example. So remember, our first step is to move c to one side all by itself. So we're going to add 24 to both sides of the equation to get c all by itself. So we're going to have x squared plus 10x, I'm going to leave a little space there and you'll see why in a second, is equal to 24. The next step is to make sure that our leading coefficient is 1, which we see that it is. So then we take our b value divide it by 2, and square it. 10 divided by 2 is 5, and 5 squared is 25. So we're going to take that value and we're going to add it to both sides of the equation, here and here. So we'll get x squared plus 10x plus 25 equals 24 plus 25. Now the next step is to write one side of the equation as a perfect square. And we know that we can write this side as the perfect square because it has the x squared in it. So before we freak out, we're going to look at what we found before we squared, which is right here. So we know that it's x plus 5 squared equals 24 plus 25 is 49. The next step then is to take the square root of both sides. So we're going to take the square root, and we'll be left with x plus 5 equals the square root of 49 is 7, plus or minus. Remember, when you take the square root, you need both signs. So now we just solve for x. So getting x by itself, we get x equals negative 5 plus or minus 7. Now we have to find the two separate answers. So one of our answers will be x equals negative 5 plus 7, or we'll get x equals negative 5 minus 7. So here we get x equals 2, and here we get x equals negative 12. And those are your two answers, and that's how you complete the square to solve for x. So let's try another example. The first step, remember, is to move c to one side of the equation all by itself. So we're going to subtract 2 from both sides, and we're going to get x squared minus 8x equals negative 2. The next step is to make sure our leading coefficient is 1, which we see that it is. So then we take our b over 2 squared, which our b in this case is negative 8. So we get negative 8 over 2 squared. Negative 8 divided by 2 is a negative 4. And when we square that, negative 4 squared is a positive 16. So the next step then is to add that value to both sides of our equation. So we're going to get x squared minus 8x plus 16 equals negative 2 plus 16. And the next step is to write one side of the equation in a perfect square. So again, we look at the value that we found before we squared it. So we get x minus 4 squared equals 14. And the next step then is to take the square root of both sides. So if we take the square root, we're left with x minus 4 equals plus or minus, don't forget those, square root of 14. Solving for x, getting x all by itself, we add 4 to both sides. So we get x equals 4 plus or minus the square root of 14. Now we have to find both answers. So we get x equals 4 plus the square root of 14, or x equals 4 minus the square root of 14. Now if you plug that into your calculators, you will get x is approximately 7.74, or x is approximately 0.26. Okay, so moving right along to the next example, we're going to try and pick up the pace to see if you're following along well. This one, our c value is already all by itself, so we don't have to worry about moving it over. So the first step we're going to do then is our b over 2 squared. Our b value is a positive 2, so we get 2 over 2 squared, which is 1 squared, which is just 1. We have to make sure that our leading coefficient is 1, which we didn't do before our b over 2 squared, but it is, so we're fine. Now that we've found this value, we add it to both sides of the equation. So we have x squared plus 2x plus 1 equals 35 plus 1. Making this side into a perfect square, we get x plus 1 squared, because remember that's what we found before we squared it, equals 36. Take the square root of both sides. We get x plus 1 equals plus or minus the square root of 36 is 6. So solving for x, getting x all by itself, we get x equals negative 1 plus or minus 6. And then we need to find the two different answers. So we get x equals negative 1 plus 6, or x equals negative 1 minus 6. So we get x equals 5 or x equals negative 7. And those will be your two answers for this problem. So our last example, we'll do it again here. Make sure your c value gets to one side all by itself. So we're going to add 4 to both sides. So we're going to get x squared minus x equals 4. Make sure our leading coefficient is 1, which we see that it is. So then we take our b value, which is a negative 1, divide it by 2, and square it, which is negative 1 squared over 2 squared, which is positive 1 over 4. And again, if you don't like the fractions, we know that 1/2 is negative 0.5 squared, which is 0.25. So we take that value, add it to both sides of our equation, here and here. So we get x squared minus x plus 0.25 equals 4 plus 0.25. Take one side of our equation and make it into a perfect square. So remember the value that we got before we squared it was negative 0.5. So we get x minus 0.5 squared equals 4.25. Take the square root of both sides. We get x minus 0.5 equals the square root of 4.25 plus or minus. Don't forget the plus or minus sign there. So then we will take negative 0.5 to the other side to get x by itself. So we get 0.5 plus or minus the square root of 4.25. And then we have to account for both of our answers. So we get x equals 0.5 plus the square root of 4.25, or x equals 0.5 minus the square root of 4.25. So if you plug that into your calculator, you'll get x is approximately 2.56, or x is approximately negative 1.56. And those are your two answers. So in review, if you haven't written down the steps yet, please do so. These are very important. Remember, the first step is to move c to the other side. And then we check if the leading coefficient is 1. And if it is, then we take the b value, divide it by 2, and square it, which is where our b over 2 squared formula comes in. The third step is to add that value to both sides of the equation. The fourth step is to write one side as a perfect square. And lastly, we'll take the square root of both sides and solve the equation for x. And that will conclude the lesson.